Good day and welcome to Business Day Spotlight. I am Dise Tsomutwening. Today we turn our attention to one of South Africa's most critical and closely watched institutions, Eskom. After years of crisis, leadership changes, instability and public frustration, there are cautious signs of recovery. Load shedding has eased, Eskom has reported its first profit in 8 years, and operational stability seems to be improving. But key questions remain. Are these gains sustainable? What's driving this turnaround? And how is Eskom positioning itself in a changing energy landscape that was once defined by its near monopoly but is now being reshaped by private generation, renewable and market reform? What does the future hold for a state utility carrying the weight of an entire nation's hopes and anxieties? Joining us in studio to unpack these issues and to share his perspectives on leading one of the most complex public institutions in South Africa is Eskom Group Chief Executive Dan Marokane. Dan, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. First of all, when you took the job, how long has it been? Like 2 years almost?
It's just under 2 years now.
Yeah. I mean, you took the job, and at the time, I'm sure a lot of people in the country were thinking, you know what, this is a job that I cannot take. But you decided to take it. What made you say yes?
Yeah, a lot of people thought I'm crazy. My family thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
But as I've said before, what made me, I used to be with the business before. I was with the utility back between 2010 and 2015. I left in 2015. I was out there in the private sector. Like most South Africans, or all South Africans, I also endured the wrath of load shedding, its intensity and frequency that was up in 2022, 2023 financial year. And it's literally within, during one of those spells that I had a meeting with myself as to whether I'll be happy to be remembered for standing by when the country was really in a big need of assistance, or whether I will put by the side all issues that I had that made me to live there and go back and join South Africans to solve this.
Yeah. So it was as much an emotional decision for public service as it was in your skills to be able to turn things around.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you? I mean, I've always been interested in this. I mean, what did you find when you got there? Did you find some things and then you were like, you know what, some people were right, that I'm crazy, this is intractable?
Yeah, look, it was a different business compared to the one that I left back in 2015, or the one that I really spent a lot of time in deeply between 2011 and 2015. I got to appreciate what lack of internal controls and what lack of financial muscle can do to a business over a very short space of time. I also got to appreciate how low employee morale can really lead to an environment that is unpalatable to be in. I got to appreciate the role of leadership in giving staff a reason to exist and to really look forward to their contributions within the workspace and be comfortable that whilst today they may experience some pain, hard work will eventually pay. So it's a lot of things that I took for granted before, or that I didn't quite appreciate how deep the well-seated within the business came to the fore.
Yeah. I mean, you touch on one, employee morale, because most of the time we look at Eskom as this abstract organization, but actually there are people within that organization that are making it work. And you got there, you found morale. Can you paint a picture for us? What was it like? What were some of the complaints that you were getting? Some of the they were probably jaded.
Look, this was, I joined a year after one of the most intense and frequent load shedding bouts. So the public perception was really negative. And I can only imagine the kind of pressure that fellow Guardians had in their families, in their communities and in society in general. but the workspace itself was not up to the right level of excitement that made people want to wake up and come to work all the time. The operational staff were coming to work. Of course, they have to be there to be able to, you know, to do the maintenance that was now beginning to pick up, to do the schedules of load shedding and so on. But other support staff were not necessarily coming back to the office since the COVID days.
Right.
You need an environment that is encouraging for employees to really want to belong. And we needed to work on that aspect. And it really takes inputs like the directives from leadership, the signals that you're sending, the tone at the top, from the board into the executive team to create an environment that people want to come to.
What was it that they felt was needed for them to, because the problem that you face, load shedding, I mean, it looked like South Africa, you know, we're going to live with this thing forever. But what, I mean, for you to be able to solve this problem that seemed intractable at the time, you needed people to be on board. You needed your employees to be on board, to feel happy, to come to work and wake up with energy to come into work. What was it that was needed right from you, right at the top, and the board, you know, to see that what we're doing here is public service?
Yeah, I think what's important is for me to set the context. I arrived in March 2024. The new board was constituted in October 2022. One of the key things that they really focused on, other than diagnosing the real problems, operational problems of the generation fleet, was to also start looking at the hygiene factors that affect employee morale. You needed to deal with the issues of culture that was in the business, be very clear in terms of what is accepted and not accepted as behaviors within the business, but also, importantly, be clear around rewards and benefits for performance beyond the expectation level. And I'm very grateful that the board had started the journey prior to my arrival. You know, I came from a background of real turnaround work. You cannot separate the issues of, you know, self-application at an intense level from rewards and benefits in a turnaround environment in a very short space of time. You cannot do that. It's a standard practice within the private sector. And so I was happy that the board was able to really get the minister's support, the shareholders' minister's support, to really look at this kind of tools. And you use these tools with the responsibility of saying to employees, this is what is expected of you, and beyond this point, this is how we reward the performance. That framework was set in motion prior to my arrival, and I built on that. I really built on that. It was part of my also consideration coming in around what are the necessary conditions that needs to be in place for us to create an environment that supports the delivery of the goals that we need in the space that we want to do so, time frame wise.
I mean, you mentioned along with employee morale, one of the things that you found was how difficult it was to run an organization facing a cash crunch. And you tying more employee morale with rewards. So that must have been very difficult for you to say, look, we will reward you, but then did you have to say, but remember, the money is tight? Given where we are at Eskom, how did you balance that?
So our employee reward scheme incentive scheme is actually self-funded. So there is no budget for it. We have to show the savings through the interventions that we are undertaking, and that pays for itself. So that was the condition of the incentive scheme, and it really puts in the right behaviors. It's we are paid for the jobs that we do. And beyond, you know, delivering beyond what we are expected to, and making the appropriate savings, that's when we all get to share in that.
I mean, I guess, accountability would then go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Tell me how that looks like.
So this starts from having very clear deliverables, and accountability is personal. Every key business area has got clarity on what they need to deliver. The generation recovery plan was distilled into very clear phases, 3 phases of what needs to be delivered. Phase A, and in phase A you deal with a period between 0 to 9 months and 9 to 15 months or to 16 months, and then thereafter the balance of the 2 year or so. We know there are very clear deliverables that needed to be reached, and those translate to the improvement in the one KPI that you see. It's the EAF, or the lights being on. So all of those build up towards that one key important indicator of performance.
I mean, did you have the labor support, like a labor union support, in terms, because once you have things like you know, accountability and deliverable, and if you're not able to deliver, then you have some lever to pull that might put you in a collision course with the labor movement. What was that?
So one of the most important interventions was actually a 3-year salary increase agreement that was reached with labor to ensure that issues relating to salary increases are not obstructing the focus and attention of everyone in the business. And I think our labor leadership must be commended for this, that they had the vision, they could understand what was critical and urgent, and they really came to the party working alongside the board. We are in conversation now around the next cycle. We are in constant contact in terms of issues that are important for the smooth running of the organization. We differ at times, as it should be, as human beings, but we are all committed to making success of the business.
Tell me how this conversation is going right now. Like how far are you?
Still early days. Still early days.
Okay.
We have discussed the principles and what we intend to really reach, but you know, the teams are still hard at work.
All right. The one thing about your job is this dual mandate. So you have to. It's a difficult one to have, because you have you're a company. At the same time, you also have to provide public service. Tell me, how do you balance that?
Look, and it's something that I was reflecting on last night, as a matter of fact. What changes are required to how we effect our mandate, our dual mandate of a commercial mindset and social responsibility on the one hand. You know, we are government owned. We are owned by the people of South Africa. And as the minister occasionally says, we are actually the go-to entity when the chips are down. So when no one is showing up to deliver service in that space, it's that responsibility falls back on us. We take that very seriously. In a reformed environment, we need to really look at some of the tools and controls that are around us that perhaps need some updating. We think that this role is very important. It needs to be played going into the future. There's room for the private sector. But when things don't work, the government has got the obligations to provide for its citizens.
That's right.
And we are that implementation agency. We may just have to adapt the manner in which we do so from time to time.
Because at the moment, I mean, just gleaning from what you're saying, Braden, maybe the law would not, I mean, there isn't enough in the toolbox for you to be able to do your dual mandate, particularly with the opening up of the electricity sector.
That's correct. But, you know, our reforms are only starting now. There are no reforms without the rules. We've been very clear that we need to spend as much time as possible and go into as much depth as practical in as far as formulating rules that should manage the reforms. The rules force all of us to reflect on what are the principles that we wanted to protect in the first instance, and how do we allocate responsibilities under those reform circumstances. And I think if we engaged meaningfully like we are doing now with the NERSA-led process, we'll find rules that are suitable for the transition phases that we are still going to go through. Many countries have gone through reforms like ours. The current rules are not exactly the same as when they started. They've had many iterations of those because they understood in principle what they wanted to achieve. And for us as well, there are things that we want to see changed. You know, the introduction of the market, requires us to really relook at the tariffs, unbundled tariffs. Without unbundled tariffs, you cannot have a market. You know, you have to ensure that when you have this kind of reforms, you understand who's your supplier of last resort. How do you protect the poor? How do you ensure that you carry capacity and is paid for appropriately? These are the things that previously we didn't have to think about as South Africa, and now we need to do so.
Can you touch on a little bit more on this supplier of last resort? Just give me a little bit more.
Well, let me give you a practical example today and yesterday and the weekend. Joburg, the sun has not been shining here, and you know, many of my friends who've got PV rooftops, all of them have been showing me on their gadgets that they're drawing from the grid. You know, that grid capacity, we're maintaining it, we're keeping it for those days when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. You know, but that grid capacity on a day when it's shining, you may actually mistakenly say it's not needed. It needs to be, nobody should pay for this. Somebody has to pay for that capacity. We are a battery of the country. You know, so we need to really understand the issues of capacity, and we also need to understand the issues of utilization that we have to pay for.
I mean, talking about reforms, I mean, you saw yesterday the Minister of Electricity came out with an ARP 2025. Do you have any immediate reaction to that? Because it's leaning heavily on renewables. Central to it is the revival of the pebble bed reactor.
Look, I mean, the IRP itself has been a subject of consultation over the last year. So we participated. What came out of it is not completely new, or you know,
maybe at least for you.
It's not completely new because it's been a subject of back and forths. We've always said the country's energy mix needs to be such that all technologies are taken on board. All technologies play different roles. We think and we maintain that base load is quite critical for economic growth. You do not do mining on the back of renewables. At the same time, you need the renewables to help you manage the third component of your energy trilemma, sustainability. We have to consider all mixes and the phasing thereof so that we can also address the issues of accessibility from both the affordability perspective, but also the socio-economic impacts that arises as a result of the transitions. And then energy security is very important. So how we phase all of this needs to really consider all three aspects of it. We are quite happy that there is strong showing on the need for base load in the form of nuclear. Going forward, gas to power. We are comfortable and happy that there's a really mature and pragmatic approach when it comes to the use of coal. You'll see that the coal component or percentage of the entire mix is declining, but in absolute terms, the coal component is not declining because what we are seeing is a growth in the renewable percentages that we should expect. And this is a model that other countries have used very successfully. India has done that. There's not been a shutting down of coal stations, but rather an increase, an uptake in as far as the renewables components are concerned, the addition of nuclear, the addition of gas to power, other technologies like hydro, you know, which are renewable in nature.
I mean,
so we are happy. We think that this RP is really taking all the three aspects of energy trilemma into consideration.
So if I could just go back to the coal bit. I mean, not so long ago, coal was something that's frowned upon. I mean, I think it still is by green activists. As you say, it's not so much that you are reducing, it's more a question of you have more renewable coming on board. What inspired the change, and what did you learn anything from? Was there an experience that said, you know what, this is,
So we just had a G20 Energy Transitions Working Group meetings in Durban 2 weeks ago. The G20 countries could not get to an agreement in as far as what transition paths should be really articulated as a common position. And this is because many countries have realized that when it came to energy security and the chips are down, they have tended to adopt a much more pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
You know, what did we see when the Russian-Ukraine war broke up? Our coal was exported to Europe that had already turned its back on coal.
Yeah.
We've seen what's happened in the US with the Trump administration when it came to these issues. We know what is happening in India, a big economy. They've not shut down their coal power stations. They've continued to invest in cleaner technologies and just grew their component of the renewables. China has grown significant amounts of renewables, but they continue to run their coal plants. The world is being pragmatic.
Yeah.
South Africa needs to be pragmatic as well. We are endowed with coal. Coal is highly interwoven into our socio-economic fabric. We need to have a transition that really enables us to not accelerate the negative consequences of economic slowdown, but rather have it in a very carefully measured way. And this is where the portion of our IRP that talks to increasing renewable component comes into play. That has to happen in a manner that enables industrialization and localization. And you really need to manage the transition phase. That's what's important for me.
It's called just transition.
Yeah, the justness needs to show.
The justness of it, yeah. Talking of which, I mean, this is, maybe I'm taking you back and forth here, but the mining industry, particularly the smelter industry, I mean, they talk about South Africa electricity prices as one of the biggest factors to them, I mean, to the sector pretty much collapsing. Any comment on that? I mean, do you feel, I mean, is there a need for a special dispensation for them, particularly if we want to industrialize and make sure that our chrome, which we are endowed with, are beneficiated and value added?
Yeah, look, we have the world's largest deposits of chrome, no doubt about that. Electricity amounts to 40% of their input costs. The other 60% still needs to be solved for, because resolving electricity alone is not going to make this go away. I think the question is much more bigger than this. Yeah. It's about the affordability of electricity to various sectors of our country. It also includes a need for a solution to address the indigent, the poor households, in terms of what is the appropriate level of the free basic electricity they should be getting. And we should agree on what is the right level of pricing that should go to which industries that contribute to economic growth, and how do you also cushion the middle class, because those need to. I'm very happy that the minister is leading this process of re-looking at the pricing policy and its approach and its objectives. It will deal with, again, as I said, protecting the indigent, stimulating economic growth in areas that we agree we need to champion as a country. And thirdly, which is also equally important, making sure that the utility itself remains sustainable going forward. We've seen in many instances we get chastised for smelters that are closing, and then the following day we get chastised for a discovery of a price of smelters that are kept open. So we need to get to a point where we agree on what are our priorities and how do we support them, and making sure that the utility cells remain functional. And I'm quite optimistic that we'll find each other, we'll find a workable solution. We are ready to contribute in that path.
What are some of the ideas on the table around that?
Look, I mean, I'll give you what's there on the table now. That's what we call negotiated pricing agreements. These are regulated within the current framework with NERSA, and they're essentially prices at a discount to standard tariffs. The industries that are allowed to have access to this are designated. There's particular conditions they must meet, and there's conditions for them to exit. This kind of protection. The bulk of the revenue is socialized amongst the rest of your customer base. Should this be the case going forward? Maybe not. Should it be there in a different way? probably that's what will come out. And the minister has said it very repeatedly that he will take input from all sectors of society in shaping the next electricity pricing policy. What we'll end up with will be something that reflects interventions to alleviate the pain for the poor, for the economy, and also for the sustainability of the utility.
So it's a bit of a trade-off. You lose in the year, and but you also have to like measurable benefit if you're going to have it negotiated.
Absolutely. There has to be something that is there for the country. But what will also be important is that we'll all have agreed in terms of under the circumstances. This is what we are happy to live with.
All right. Let me then move on to the turnaround at Eskom. Just earlier this month, it was good news. Let's get that straight. It was good news. First profit in 8 years, and I think that also gave you confidence to say, you know what, we're just 300 billion plus in capex over the next 5 years. However, there were also some caveats in it. But first, before we get to the fragility, if it's fragile, I mean, you may not agree with me, but just tell me about how, I mean, you touch on staff morale as one of the key issues that you worked on. But there were other things that you can own yourself. I mean, that happened there. It's not a miracle. So can you lay that out for our...
Look, the turnaround of our business is really on the back of the successful execution of the Generation Recovery Plan. The Generation Recovery Plan has seen us improve our availability from low levels to close to 70% now in the last month. We've been averaging 70%, just over 70%, which is our target point. When you keep your lights on for 97% of the time, like in the year 2023, 2024, and now at 98% year to date in 2025, compared to 9% in the previous year, and you halve your diesel bill by 16 billion rands, you start putting yourself in a space where your EBITDA and your EBITDA margins improve. And that's where we've gotten ourselves back to. We are not where we want to be. We are not where we want to be because we still want to extract some efficiencies out of the business. So we're working on our income statement. We have, our cost optimization and revenue enhancement program that we call CORE that is gaining traction. And this seeks to take out between 50 and 100 billion rands out of our cost base in the next 5 years. This is the aspect that our stakeholders and our key strategic partners will have to come to the party and assist us with. If we are to be able to deliver a single-digit tariff increase going forward, we need to take some costs out. We need to start seeing some other revenue streams coming in that will make up for the sales decline that naturally occurs as a result of other players coming into the space. We are not faced by that. We think that the asset base that we have, the people that we have, our experience places us in a position where we can start having other revenue streams that we must take advantage of. So you should see our financial performance within the context of the improved operational performance from the Generation Recovery Plan. And what have we brought? What have I brought to the table? I've owned up this plan. I've looked at it when I came in. And said to the board, we need to just go and continue to drive its execution. It's about disciplined execution that we bring to the party. It's about the right capabilities in the positions. We have the Generation Group Executive that was there a year before me. He's made some changes in the power stations to ensure that we have the right talent mix responding to the challenges as they exist. But we're fixing the other parts of the business. That executive team now has got 60% of new recruits because our focus is both on fixing our operations, but also on pivoting to set up our business to continue in the new environment of competition. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this particular newspaper, Business Day, I mean, we carried an editorial shortly after you issued your results, and then we said that the recovery is fragile, and then we cited two reasons. One was the municipal debt, which, if it continues in this current trend, it could top 300 billion rand by 2030. We cited the tariff gap, which you just touched on, and then you, yes, I get it, that you will mitigate that with the core revenue optimization program. Why are we wrong about that assessment? That's fragile.
Look, you're not wrong. I mean, we've said it ourselves. We are the first to call it out.
Okay.
That the performance that you are observing, in part, comes from the positive contribution of the debt relief package from NT. It's allowed us to be able to plan better. And be ready to execute our plans sufficiently in time. So we had no liquidity issues to buying spares and doing the planning that's required for generation recovery. We said it ourselves that if the current trajectory of Munich debt is not retarded, we'll end up with all the benefits of the debt relief being eroded. And therefore, we have implored on all stakeholders that the distribution agency agreement at the minimum should be an intervention that is really seized by all, so we can hold this further deterioration in terms of Munich debt. So we have highlighted that, and you are right. In that space, I'm comfortable that all parties now do realize the urgency of this. We have great shareholder support together with NT, and now with SALGA and the corporate, their appropriate ministry. That we should have some form of distribution agency agreement in place soon for us to start doing the interventions of collections from the municipalities, but also helping the municipalities be capacitated to run their electricity departments better. This is an interim solution. The long-term solution has to do with the total reforms of the Munichs and making them viable to provide the services that they are responsible for. And this is an aspect that needs to be addressed. The collapse of the municipalities and the debt they owe to Eskom is actually a national risk. It's not an Eskom risk, it's a national risk. Because this says, I want to put this to you, and it is a sobering thought that in no country have you had reforms of the type that we envisage without a sustainable incumbent. So the precursor to successful transformations and reforms is actually an incumbent that is also sustainable going forth. Because this is not about taking what is on the table and splitting it amongst new players. It's about growing what's on the table so that you can have the right level of economic growth. And in that process, everybody else gets to grow. So it's important that the aspects associated with the sustainability of Eskom are not seen as aspects that are irrelevant when you're going to have competition. You need a functioning Eskom for the reforms to actually take place and be successful as well.
And municipalities are central to that because they are, what, 40%?
They're 40% of our customer base, And you also need municipalities that are functional. So, the DAA is an interim solution, but you need to ultimately, get to a point of proper structural reforms for the municipalities themselves to be able to deal with services, water, electricity, and you name them. So we need to also deal with that aspects. So the reform space needs to be seen in totality.
I mean, I guess the good thing is that Operation Vulindlela, as the next phase, municipalities is one of them. So let's see what comes out of that. Let's go back to CORE, your revenue optimization program. When people talk about taking out costs, one of the things that come out is my job safe? But having spoken to you before, this doesn't look like it's stuff. Cutting stuff will be on the agenda.
Yeah, look, let me give you something that I was dealing with before I came here.
Yeah.
Our NTCSA business traditionally had 9 billion rands of capex to spend in the last 3-4 years.
Yeah.
They now have to ratchet up to about 22, 25 for the next 5 or 7, 8 years. That's growth.
Yeah.
That needs to be supported by human beings. Of course, you need to be very efficient in terms of how you hire, how you structure work, bring in technology to make it more efficient, but you're still going to need more bodies to support this kind of growth. For us, it's about releasing capacity from areas that can do otherwise towards those that need attention.
Okay.
Our new value propositions are all intensive in terms of utilization of our human capital.
Yeah, and then between, if you're going to take between 50 and 100 billion rand out of the system and maybe put it somewhere to offset the tariff gap, where do you see that coming from? How
there are a number of things that we need to attend to. Procurement is one big lever. How we buy, how we approach our purchasing. Our suppliers from a purchasing power perspective. There are things that we can do innovatively there. There's a lot more that we can benefit from adoption of technology and or deployment of more technology in that space. There are some dispensations that we may seek in terms of how we approach markets under the current rules of the PFMA. There's quite a number of levers that we can really work with. We can do better demand planning, and that also comes into reduction of wastage within our value chain. We've started this process about 18 months ago. We've pushed it to a point where we are essentially at the edge or end of what we can extract on our own, so we have onboarded support to really drive specific areas of interest that can deliver that kind of change. Equally, we're focusing on new revenues. Where the new revenues that traditionally we have not really been focusing on, and we'll deliver those through multiple products, especially in our distribution business. Quite exciting stuff in the e-mobility space. There's quite a lot of opportunities there for us.
What would success look like, particularly on the revenue, new income streams that you? It's a EV stuff.
So at the top line, we've just shown you a circa 100 billion rands EBITDA business. In our forecast, we said we should be able to stay between 90 or 85, 95 going forward. That's what we're targeting. We're targeting a healthier EBITDA margin of over 35%. We've seen some very good directional improvements in as far as all our financial ratios are concerned, and that's where we really want to stay in. Everything else needs to really be contributing towards this. There are revenue streams that come out of new categories of customers that we need to chase and chase harder. Data center is a big blooming business. We have a big focal point within our distribution business on this. Bitcoin mining, there's opportunities that may arise out of flexible tariff approach as capacity becomes available going forth. We have to think very differently, and some of the things that we really want to do here is have a framework, a regulatory framework or space to be able to do this that was perhaps not there before, because we are fully run as a state entity.
Would Eskom Green fall under that category, or is it?
Eskom Green is conceptualized to really be a lean and meaner version of the rest of our operations, because it will primarily have or fund its projects through partnerships, public-private partnerships. So it requires agility, a lot of versatility that's not there necessarily in the other parts of our business. It will be competing head-on with the IPPs, and so it's tailored to really, from the onset, be an entity that's got very, very low or high efficiencies.
I mean, there's been some, I don't know if it's suspicion or if it's rooted in facts that Eskom Green might have preferential access to the grid, and that would not be fair for the rest of the market. Are they imagining this, or is this, does this fall under Eskom as being the supplier of last resort?
Yeah, look, look. I think it's okay to have this kind of suspicions. This tend to be the kind of environment when you start being competitive. We've said it ourselves that we are ready for competition, and we're actually happy that it's coming, because we can also display our capabilities. All of this noise came up after we went out and did market inquiries for about 290 megawatts that we want to place. But let me remind you that Eskom as a business 3 years ago placed a lot of its land that's adjacent to its power station and close to grid infrastructure that is not congested for public uptake. You'll recall this. Of the participants in that process, only 1 or 2 are remaining in terms of meeting their obligations to progress those projects. You know, this is in the areas where grid is not constrained like it is in the Northern Cape, in the Western Cape. So, and we have said we'll start our transition and repowering on land adjacent to our operations where grid is not congested. I'm comfortable that the processes that we've agreed on, in as far as interim grid access rules are concerned, are there for inspection, and anybody can go and check as to who's applied for grid access where and what were the processes being followed. I don't think that we are so naive to want to behave anti-competitively so early in the establishment of the process. So the concerns have been raised. We've been asked questions. We have answered over and over again. We'll answer again. And maybe we have to wait for some substantive evidence of what creates this discomfort. What is clear is that you know, our entry into this space is also making customers start having more choices and are looking towards us. We've seen this when we introduced our nuclear attributes. Once nuclear was regarded as clean and we put the nuclear attributes out, we had a lot of people being unhappy because suddenly they could not necessarily have the same kind of willpower over customers or not. And we've put 290 megawatts. We are very clear. By the end of 2026, we would like to place into the market some consideration for some 2 gigawatts of projects. We have scale. We have the ability to do things at scale at the level that no other entity in the country can, because we are a big utility. And many of the big European utilities that came into this country for IPPs some 10 years ago, 5 years ago, looking to partner with someone like us, are now happier that they've got an option to do so, because we can communicate and engage at the same level of technical expertise. So competition will always bring a little bit of discomfort here and there. We'll just play by the rules.
Then I got to ask you this. I mean, I think to me this is one of the most important questions I ask for leaders of this country. Where did you grow up, and what? It was.
Well, I I grew up in Brits. It's just to the north of Pretoria. Northwest of Pretoria. Brits, Ga-Rankuwa.
Not far from Next.
Harties. I grew up in those localities. I went to school in Makau, the village in Makau, just on the outskirts of Ga-Rankuwa. So that's really where the Young Den was formed. I went to schools, local schools in those neighborhoods, but I think the most defining moment for me was my high school education at the Catholic high school called Tsoho in Makau, run by Irish nuns and Italian priests. And that's really where I got what I look back at as one of my most important formation period from a leadership perspective.
What was it? What did they... I mean, I guess that wasn't as much a Bantu education as Yeah,
Oh, it was a very good school.
yeah.
It was a very good school.
Yeah,
I mean, we didn't have to worry about what will be the percentage of students that pass matric.
Yeah.
We didn't have to worry about how many university acceptances you know you'll get in your class. We really got the fortune of getting very good education in an environment of Christian upbringing that really protected us and made up in many ways. It made up for some of the deficiencies in families that didn't have very strong parental guidance or where the streets were rough. So we spent a lot of time at school, and that really shielded us from many of the bad things that could have befallen us coming from the types of families that we had.
I mean, would you say that type of upbringing, you carry some of the values that you got from there into this?
So we are also taught to be human beings. Social consciousness was developed at that early stage. And because of who we are and the kind of opportunities that we had and achievements that we subsequently made in life, we are always mindful of how do we play that back? How do we contribute? How do we give hope to you know, a young boy and girl out there who may think that their destiny is already predetermined for them by just the mere circumstances of their own family setup? And we are living proof that, you know, hard work, taking opportunities with both hands does pay. And what's important for me is to remain connected to those kind of communities, because then you're going to have many dens going forward in various walks of life.
No, absolutely. Then, I mean, thank you very much. I don't know, I really enjoyed this conversation. I don't know if there's anything that I forgot to ask that you would like to add.
You can always send me an email. No, but thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and thanks for the time that you and your team have taken to follow up on our stories. We appreciate you communicating our story to the South Africans, but also holding us accountable by asking us the difficult questions.
No, thank you very much. I mean, but actually, there's this one last one that I need to ask. I mean, your legacy is intact at so far at Eskom. What would you like to be remembered for? I mean, when you decide to pass on the baton, like, what is it that you like to see?
Energy security is very important for economic growth, and for us in a society that we have that is still so fragmented or unequal. Economic growth will help us resolve a lot of the social ills. So for playing a part in ensuring that there's energy security, I'll be the happiest person to retire at some point. And that's what I really want to do for my country.